A tomato, seemingly simple, is shaking the entire trade balance of North America. When the U.S. imposed a 17% tariff on Mexican tomatoes, they didn't just strike a food item, but unintentionally triggered a wave of global supply chain restructuring. Without responding with words, Mexico quietly shifted its focus to Canada. And from there, the world began to witness a role reversal. A superpower gradually losing its position, right at its own dinner table. A blow from a single tax line. No alarm sounded, no official press conference, no apology, just a short announcement from Washington on the morning of July 14, 2025. The U.S. government will terminate the 2019 Tomato Suspension Agreement with Mexico and impose a 17% import tariff on all fresh tomatoes from that country, effective immediately. A cold, sterile line of information. But for millions of citizens, businesses, farmers, and importers, it was an unannounced stab, piercing straight into an already fragile food supply chain, shaking the economy of the entire North American region. In recent years, tomatoes have been more than just agricultural products. They are the lifeblood of a cross-border agricultural distribution system. Over two-thirds of fresh tomatoes consumed in the U.S. originate from Mexico, equivalent to more than $3 billion in annual trade value. Those Roma, beefsteak, and red grape tomatoes don't just appear in salsa or salads. They form part of the operating structure of supermarkets, restaurants, school cafeterias, and the broader U.S. fresh food industry. To touch tomatoes is to strike an economic artery, something Washington seems to have underestimated. The issue wasn't just the tariff rate. It was how it was done. No transition period, no prior bilateral negotiations, no sign that this was a carefully considered measure based on consumer interest. It came like a slash, sudden, unilateral, and unprepared. American businesses, especially food distribution chains in California, New York, and Illinois, weren't just caught off guard. They were left stranded, unable to adjust orders or find replacement partners in time. The first to feel the shock weren't analysts. It was ordinary people. In Raleigh, the price of beefsteak tomatoes jumped from $2.99 to $4.35 per pound in just a few weeks. In Los Angeles, Roma tomatoes that once cost less than common greens now exceeded $3.80 per pound, a level never seen before for what had long been a staple item. In public schools across Illinois, cafeterias began removing tomatoes from the lunchtime salad menu, switching to industrial mixed greens. In Georgia, pizza chains gradually dropped fresh tomato toppings, switching to canned sauce. In this context, each tomato was no longer a culinary option. It became a household economic decision. The bitter truth is, American consumers were never asked. There was no referendum on whether they wanted to pay 40% more to protect domestic farmers, a group accounting for less than 1% of total national tomato consumption. No one asked a single mother in New Jersey whether she could still afford salad for her 3 kids this week. No one asked a retiree in Texas, living on $1,200 a month, whether he was willing to give up fresh vegetables to support a political decision. But behind the numbers lies something even more serious, a misread message. The U.S. ending the suspension agreement wasn't just an economic blow, it was perceived by Mexico and many other nations as an act of disrespect, a rejection of over 30 years of trust-building in bilateral agricultural relations. While Mexico had accepted floor price adjustments, expanded supply chain transparency, and endured numerous trade inspections, what they received in return was a cold shoulder. Silence from the White House made the issue even more perplexing. At press briefings, there was no explanation from the Department of Agriculture or Department of Commerce about the basis for the dumping allegation. No plan to support urban consumers. No strategy to replace the lost imports. In that void, the feeling of abandonment didn't just come from Mexico, but from American citizens themselves. A quick survey by Axios revealed that 74% of consumers disagreed with using tariffs to control essential food items if it meant sharp price increases and unstable supply. And there's another, harder-to-discuss dimension: market trust. Retailers, supermarket chains, restaurants, all are starting to ask, if today it's tomatoes, what will it be tomorrow? Bell peppers? Cucumbers? Strawberries? A trade policy cannot function on sudden campaign-driven decisions, because trust, once broken, isn't mended by words. It requires action, a roadmap, and above all, consistency. Tomatoes didn't cause the crisis. The way they were treated did. When a basic commodity becomes a victim of policy inconsistency, the damage is not just to consumer wallets, but to the entire economic model of mutual trust that has sustained a region for 3 decades. And the saddest part? That blow came from the very hand that once promised to protect the American dinner table. The silent rails of a withdrawal. When the United States chose to build a tariff wall, Mexico didn't climb over it, nor did they try to tear it down. They quietly dug a tunnel underneath. No declaration of retaliation, no dramatic statements, no urgent calls for negotiation. In silence, they chose to do something no one thought they could do this quickly: restructure their entire agricultural export chain, cut off the traditional transit point, the U.S., and open a new trade route, colder, longer, and independent. The Bajío region, the agricultural heart of Mexico, was born to serve the U.S. market. Tomato farms stretching from Guanajuato to Jalisco weren't just places of cultivation, but links in a carefully built cross-border logistics system developed over decades. That system used to run smoothly. Refrigerated trucks left Bajío in the early morning, passed through border checkpoints in El Paso or Laredo, and arrived on store shelves in Texas, Arizona, and beyond within 48 to 72 hours. But after July 14th, that system no longer operated as before, and Mexico, instead of complaining, decided not to repair it. They chose to build a new one. In less than 90 days, one of the most modern transnational cold chain transport systems in the region was activated. A refrigerated intermodal rail line linking Bajío to Ontario and Quebec officially began operations. The journey was longer than the old route through the U.S. border, but in return, it had one thing the old route no longer offered: stability. No more waiting at inspection stations. No more permits that changed with each election cycle. No more pressure from erratic tariff policies. Just a fixed schedule, a maintained temperature between +1 to -1 degrees Celsius, and long-term contracts signed with Canadian partners, where the authority no longer rested in Washington. What's notable is who led this transformation. Not a politician, not the Minister of Agriculture, but a logistics engineer, the president of the ANARM Agricultural Export Association. He didn't speak at international forums. He didn't appear on television. He appeared only once, in El País, with a sharp statement: if a market sees us as a risk, it's time to find one that sees us as an opportunity. And that market was Canada. Until now, Canada had been viewed as a satellite in the North American trade structure. Close, but not particularly proactive. But this time, Ottawa didn't just open the door, they rolled out the red carpet in a quiet yet decisive manner. Major food distribution corporations like Loblaws, Sobeys, and Metro didn't just place tomato orders. They sent full technical teams down to Bajío, assessed cold infrastructure, proposed packaging standards, redesigned labeling, and signed 5-year contracts on the spot, while the U.S. was still organizing transition meetings. This says more than just commerce. It's a shift in the philosophy of partnership. While the U.S. treated Mexican produce as a bargaining chip, Canada viewed it as a strategic partner. While one side imposed terms through executive orders, the other built relationships through trust. And for Mexico, a country long accustomed to waiting for signals from Washington, for the first time, they stopped waiting. This doesn't just affect tomatoes. According to data from FreightWaves, over 48% of Mexico's fresh produce orders in 2026 will be redirected to Canada, including bell peppers, strawberries, avocados, onions, and dairy products. And along with that comes massive infrastructure. Cold distribution centers in Vancouver and Toronto, new post-harvest storage funded by the Mexican Development Bank, and a series of cross-border trade insurance agreements no longer governed by U.S. law. Redirecting a supply chain isn't just a logistics decision. It's a strategic one. It shows that Mexico is no longer a cheap transit station, but an export enterprise with vision, ready to bet on partners who value long-term cooperation more than short-term leverage. The question now is, if in just 3 months Mexico can pivot a multi-billion-dollar supply chain, do they really need the U.S. to survive anymore? Or is it the U.S. that should be asking whether they still hold a seat at the trade table they once led? A nation doesn't walk away from the table out of anger, but because it has learned how to cook its own meal. And in that reconstruction, Canada didn't say much, but they set the table, ready for Mexico to take a seat. When the quiet neighbor becomes the guide. For 3 decades, if there was a country that understood its dependent position on the U.S. economy, it was Mexico. And if there was a country once seen as the polite shadow beside 2 often conflicted giants, it was Canada. Yet in 2025, those roles quietly and unexpectedly reversed. When the U.S. built a wall, Mexico didn't beg to step through. They turned and looked for another door. And the door that opened didn't come from flowery promises, but from a partner long known for its quiet demeanor, Canada. There was no need for a summit, no need for a global PR campaign. While Washington turned tomatoes into a political bargaining chip, Ottawa saw it simply as an infrastructure need, essential, vulnerable, and worth protecting. That very calmness, without noise, demands, or confrontation, became the decisive advantage. Inside Canada's retail giants, something nearly unprecedented happened. The 3 biggest names, Loblaws, Metro, and Sobeys, simultaneously sent technical teams to Mexico in August. They didn't ask the government for support. They didn't need officials to mediate. They went on their own, assessed on their own, and signed deals on their own, at a pace that even surprised their Mexican counterparts. According to a logistics director from Metro, "We don't care why the U.S. did it. What we care about is whether we can secure a stable supply and reasonable prices for our consumers over the next 5 years." And the answer they found lay in the fields of Bajío. The agreement signed wasn't just a basic purchase contract. It was a 5-year commitment with clear terms for quality, storage temperature, delivery speed, cost schedule, and, most importantly, no policy changes based on election cycles. A level of assurance that U.S. retailers, where laws shift with executive orders, haven't enjoyed in years. Thanks to that philosophy, Canada did the unthinkable. In less than 12 months, Mexico's tomato market share in Canada rose from under 1% to nearly 20%, an unprecedented figure. But the real distinction wasn't speed. It was how Canada didn't boast, but let the numbers and stability speak. In a global trade landscape fractured by protectionism, Canada emerged not as a U.S. rival, but as a quiet alternative built on trust. In Ottawa, no speeches of opposition. In Toronto, no critical tweets. Just a clear electronic customs system, consistent food safety laws, and inspection standards that don't change every term. That's the environment Mexico needed, and found. Even more notably, Canada didn't stop at tomatoes. Avocados, strawberries, bell peppers, red onions, even mangoes, products once considered exclusive imports for the U.S., are gradually shifting north. Not because they're cheaper, but because confidence no longer swings with every time Washington feels the need to send a political message. At a strategic level, this is more than a commercial success. It's a transfer of role between two longtime allies. The U.S. once was the axis of every trade decision in the region. But in the deafening silence following the 17% order, consumers, suppliers, and neighboring countries began looking north, where politeness doesn't mean weakness, and consistency is the strongest weapon. A Canadian Agricultural Council expert once said, "We don't have the GDP of the U.S., but we can do something America sometimes forgets: keep our word." In this context, that line rings like a new declaration for 21st century trade. Trust is the most valuable commodity in the global supply chain. And then, as American consumers ask why their salad is missing a few tomato slices, in Vancouver or Montreal, Mexican tomatoes still quietly sit on the shelf. No statement, no quarrel, no need for politics to prove their value. Simply, there, at the right time and the right price. That is how Canada is gradually proving a truth the world seemed to have forgotten. In trade, you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to be consistent to be trusted. When respect becomes the strongest competitive advantage. In an era where trade agreements can be torn apart with a single signature and trust can collapse after just one tweet, people are beginning to realize stability is no longer a given. It has become a kind of asset, rare, valuable, and capable of reshaping entire global value chains. In this context, Canada's rise isn't the result of an ambitious push, but the outcome of a long-held philosophy: treating partners like friends, not tools. The way the U.S. treated Mexico in the tomato tariff case wasn't merely a tax policy. For many in the agricultural sectors of both countries, it was a symbolic insult. For over 30 years, the agricultural supply chain between the two nations wasn't just numbers. It was shared harvests, joint quality inspections, overcoming technical barriers, and farming improvements aligned with USDA standards. But in a single day, all of that was reduced to suspected fraud, dumping risks, and political liabilities. Trust, once built through long-term cooperation, was replaced by a wary gaze. And when treated as a burden instead of a partner, Mexico had no reason to stay. They didn't shout. They didn't renegotiate. They walked away, quietly but decisively. But that very action created a gap. And what's worth noting is, Canada didn't rush to fill it. They simply stood there, door open, standards unchanged, and said, "If you need a place to work long-term, we won't change." This story isn't just about a trade shift. It speaks to a difference in the definition of power. The U.S. believes strength comes from the ability to apply pressure, from forcing others to adjust to them. But Canada has shown a different kind of strength, the pull of consistency. When you don't threaten, don't surprise, don't impose, you not only preserve trust, you attract those wounded elsewhere to come to you. In global supply chains, policy risk is now among the highest-rated factors when corporations decide where to place logistics centers or long-term infrastructure. A country can have abundant resources, cheap labor, and a large market, but if policies change every 4 years, if each new president rewrites the rules, then all those advantages become fragile. And that's what's happening in the U.S., where trade commitments no longer seem to outlast an election cycle. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, a heavy silence is taking place. No promises, no demands. Yet each contract signed with Mexico, each new cold storage center inaugurated, each freight train from Bajío to Toronto is evidence of one truth. In long-term trade, respect is the strongest currency. People used to say trade was a game of strategy, but 2025 is showing it's also a test of national ethics. And in that test, sometimes you don't need to answer brilliantly. You just need to stay true to yourself when everything else is spinning. Canada didn't change, and for that reason, they were chosen. Not because they are richer, stronger, or bigger, but because they keep their word when others do not. The silent wave from a crack. No one expected that the collapse of a bilateral trade agreement would trigger a seismic shockwave stretching far beyond the borders of the Americas. Starting from a tax line that seemed to only affect Mexican tomatoes, a domino effect is now shaking the confidence of an entire network of countries in the global supply chain. Nations that had quietly relied on the U.S. as a central guidepost. But that small crack has now widened, and Mexico is the first to dare step through it without looking back. From Brussels to Tokyo, from Bogota to São Paulo, eyes are beginning to turn toward Mexico. Not because it's a superpower, but because it just did what no one else dared to do: cut its dependency on an economy once thought irreplaceable. Without hitting back like China, without provoking like some European allies, Mexico chose a quiet, step-by-step, well-planned path. And that very approach is making the world take notice. In the European Union, which once suffered under surprise steel and aluminum tariffs from the Trump administration, policymakers are now asking a new question. If Mexico can restructure its export chain without the U.S., can we do the same? According to a leaked internal document from the European Parliament, a group of trade advisors is proposing to establish an off-season logistics route from South America to Europe, completely bypassing U.S. ports, to enhance the EU's agricultural and food autonomy amid Washington's policy volatility. In South America, the shift is even more pronounced. Colombia, a country that once saw the U.S. as the #1 destination for its agricultural goods, increased banana exports to the EU by 17% in Q2 of 2025. Brazil signed a 10-year deal to supply organic vegetables to the Netherlands, and Peru is negotiating off-season cooperation with Western Canadian provinces, regions that were once seen merely as backup plans in case the U.S. faltered. But now, those backup plans are gradually becoming primary options, as U.S. policy risks are seen more as obstacles than opportunities. And then there's Asia, where major economies have long been accustomed to adjusting policies to please Washington. But this year, they are not standing aside. In Japan, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI, sent an observation delegation to Mexico in July. Not to negotiate, but to learn. How did a mid-sized economy redraw its export map in just 3 months without relying on the U.S.? In South Korea, agricultural corporations are starting to shift imports from Central America through Vancouver instead of Long Beach. Even Taiwan has begun building an agricultural distribution center in British Columbia as a new gateway for the entire ASEAN supply chain. What's interesting here is not that these countries want to react to the U.S., they are not seeking retaliation. Instead, they want a real Plan B, a space where stability is not dictated by election results in a distant nation. For a long time, Washington believed its central role was inevitable, like a gravitational pull that couldn't be replaced. But now, familiar satellites are finding their own orbits around new axes. Not because they're rebelling, but because they're tired. Tired of inconsistency, tired of broken promises, and tired of constantly reshaping strategic plans to chase a country that keeps rewriting the rules. In that wave, Canada is emerging not as a superpower, but as a land where trust can anchor. And Mexico, through its quiet exit, has become a new model for independent trade in an age of uncertainty. What once seemed like a small crack beneath the surface of North America has now become the world's turning point, and this restructuring has only just begun. when the ones paying the price aren't the partners, but the consumers? In every economic policy decision, the damage is often hidden behind dry statistics. But when the change shows up in every meal, every grocery bill, every worried glance from a mother as her child asks, "Why aren't there tomatoes in the salad today?" then what was once called a protection policy reveals its true face, a silent burden placed squarely on the shoulders of ordinary people. When the U.S. announced a 17% tariff on fresh tomatoes from Mexico, policymakers called it a necessary step to protect domestic farmers. But they forgot that most Americans don't live in farming states, don't grow tomatoes in their backyards, and have no choice but to walk into supermarkets. And there, in less than 2 months, fresh tomato prices surged by 30 to 45%. Triggering a wave of seemingly small changes that touched every corner of the kitchen. In Raleigh, North Carolina, beefsteak tomatoes that once sold for $2.99 per pound are now $4.35 per pound. A jump that's forced many middle-class families to cut back on fresh vegetables during each shopping trip. In Los Angeles, Roma tomatoes, a staple for salsa and sandwiches, once priced under $1 per pound, have now exceeded $3.80 per pound, prompting many restaurants to revise menus, even eliminating fresh tomatoes from ingredient lists altogether. In public schools across Illinois, the familiar lunchtime salad no longer includes cool slices of tomato. Instead, it's replaced by a type of industrial mixed greens, cheaper, easier to store, but lacking the flavor that once made school meals enjoyable. Pizza chains in Georgia are switching from fresh tomatoes to canned sauce to cut costs. And in countless kitchens across America, food choices are no longer about taste. They're budget calculations. The irony is, American consumers are paying for a decision they weren't even consulted on. The ones who crafted these protectionist policies aren't the ones standing in line at Walmart with SNAP cards, not the retirees living on fixed pensions, and certainly not the single parents counting pennies at the checkout. Yet they, the furthest from the decision-making process, are the ones bearing the most direct consequences. Even American businesses that relied on Mexican imports have been placed at a disadvantage. According to a survey by Axios, hundreds of produce importers in Texas, Florida, and Arizona weren't given advance notice to renegotiate contracts or prepare alternative supply plans. Many scrambled to source from Guatemala or Peru, but logistics costs skyrocketed. Quality was inconsistent, and longer shipping times doubled spoilage rates. Rather than being protected, as Washington claimed, they were pushed into new commercial risks, losing customers, losing orders, and ultimately losing reputation. Meanwhile, in Canada, the same Mexican tomatoes are sold for 8 to 10% less than in the U.S., thanks to an optimized cold chain logistics system and a stable, tariff-free policy environment. So the question arises, if Canadian consumers can enjoy high-quality fresh tomatoes at a lower price, why are Americans, right next to the border, paying more for the same product? Protecting farmers shouldn't mean making life harder for consumers. Self-sufficiency shouldn't mean self-inflicted harm. When just 1% of farmers receive support, while 99% of consumers must sacrifice, then it's no longer a trade policy. It becomes an ethical dilemma. A tomato is no longer just food. It's now a certificate of instability, a small slice reflecting a larger policy. And the saddest part is, the American people, those who once believed in the stability of their dinner table, are now paying the price for decisions that weren't theirs to make. A tomato and the moment America lost the center. If someone said that a tomato could make America lose its central role in North America's supply chain, you might laugh. But in 2025, when shelves in Detroit, New Jersey, and Dallas began to lack that familiar red hue, and when cold freight lines from Bajío skipped the northern border and turned toward Toronto and Vancouver, that laughter gave way to awkward silence. Could America still hold the role it once created? For decades, the U.S. wasn't just a destination for goods, it was the hub around which every value chain revolved. From production to logistics, from inspection to technical standards, every trade route in the region had to pass through Washington, not just with goods, but with consensus. But this time, Mexico chose a different path. No debates, no reaction. They simply walked off the stage, and Canada raised its hand to catch the spotlight. Mexico's restructuring of its export network wasn't just a trade response. It was a declaration of economic sovereignty. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait to be let back in. They built a new system, one that doesn't pass through the U.S., that doesn't require Washington's approval. And from that moment, the question was no longer, when will Mexico come back, but how many other countries will follow? Meanwhile, Canada quietly created something the U.S. always believed was impossible: a strategic agricultural import axis from Mexico that doesn't pass through California or Texas. And it didn't stop at produce. Multiple sources from Bloomberg revealed that electronics plants in Guanajuato are being surveyed by Japanese and German firms for direct exports to Asia, bypassing U.S. ports entirely. A quiet successor is emerging, where America's centrality is being peeled away, not by confrontation, but by being bypassed. America has never lost its role by being overthrown. It loses it when its closest partners no longer wait. When long-term contracts are signed in Ottawa, when Eurasian logistics teams flood into Mexico to scout non-U.S. routes, the message is clear. Centrality doesn't come from strength, but from stability. And when you are no longer stable, you are no longer central. What once made America great wasn't just military might or GDP scale. It was the trust that you could build a 5, 10, or 20-year plan with them without being derailed by each election cycle. But that trust has faded, and the tomato, a fragile, perishable, low-margin product, has become the most honest indicator of that instability. Because if something as simple as a tomato can't cross the U.S. border without being hit by surprise tariffs, who dares to bet that high-tech goods, pharmaceuticals, or electric vehicles won't fall into the same risk? While policymakers in Washington continue to debate ethical protectionism or strategic autonomy, consumers are paying more. Businesses are shifting infrastructure, and countries are redrawing supply chain maps, without the U.S. in the center. It's a painful reality, not because anyone hates America, but because no one can afford to keep waiting. Mexico didn't declare a breakup. They simply said no, quietly, and built a world of trade that doesn't ask for permission. And to the north, Canada didn't declare a role change. They simply stayed in place, reliable, stable, ready to become the new anchor. Not every day in history is written in blood, fire, or victory. Sometimes it's written by a tomato no longer on sale. And sometimes that very absence is what forces the world to change.